What happens when the quietest man in the royal family becomes the one person the king cannot push aside? For years, Prince Edward was treated like the son who stayed in the background. No scandals, no endless headlines, no public battles. He did the work, kept his head down, and asked for very little. But now, according to the claims at the heart of this royal storm, that same quiet prince has become the center of one of the most explosive family conflicts in years. Because this is no longer just about titles, it is not just about a house, and it is definitely not just about a tiara. At the center of it all is a question the palace never wanted asked out loud. What if Queen Elizabeth II put protections in place before she died that even King Charles cannot undo? That is the idea driving this entire crisis. And if it is true, that it changes everything. The story begins with a legal file, not a speech, not a ceremony, not a family summit behind closed doors, a file. One packed with signed agreements, old financial records, personal commitments, and documents that, taken together, were said to form a wall around everything Prince Edward had spent years securing. When that dossier was finally laid on the table, it did more than defend his position. It reportedly forced the palace to confront something it had counted on keeping vague. Some royal decisions, once made and legally protected, cannot simply be reshaped by whoever comes next. And that is where this turns from family tension into something much bigger. Because if Edward truly holds legal control over what he inherited, then this was never just a matter of palace preference. It was a direct collision between a king's authority and a late queen's final intentions. To understand why the stakes became so high, you have to go back to Queen Elizabeth II's final years. By then, she had seen enough to know exactly how power moved inside the royal family. She had watched loyalties shift. She had watched the institution tighten around questions of money, titles, residence, and control. She knew what happened when decisions were left open to interpretation. So if these claims are accurate, she did what she had always done when it mattered most. She made her position clear before anyone else could rewrite it. The title of Duke of Edinburgh was never just another royal label. It carried the weight of Prince Philip's life, his service, his identity, and the role he held for more than 70 years. Queen Elizabeth knew what that title meant, and she also knew who, in her eyes, had earned the right to carry it forward. Edward had always been seen as the son who remained steady. He did not bring chaos. He did not humiliate the institution. He did not force the monarchy into endless crisis management. If there was one son who represented reliability, it was him. So when the dukedom eventually passed to Edward, it was seen by many as the fulfillment of something long understood within royal circles. But the title, according to this version of events, was only half the inheritance. The other half was Bagshot Park, and that is where the real fight begins. Bagshot Park is not simply a large royal property, it is symbolic. It gives physical reality to the title. Without it, the Duke of Edinburgh becomes ceremonial in the weakest sense of the word. A title without a center, a role without a seat, a name without ground beneath it. That is why this issue matters so much. If you separate Edward from Bagshot Park, you do more than inconvenience him. You hollow out the inheritance itself. According to the claims in this story, Queen Elizabeth understood that risk. That is why she allegedly tied the estate to the title in a way meant to survive her. And just as important, Prince Philip reportedly understood it too. By the end of his life, he had spent decades watching how royal power was used, how pressure could be applied quietly, how things could be reclassified, reviewed, delayed, and reshaped until someone was left with far less than they thought they had been given. If he believed Edward would one day need protection, then a document tying the estate to the title would not be sentimental. It would be strategic, and strategy matters because after Elizabeth's death, a different philosophy appears to have taken over. The argument at the center of the dispute is simple. King Charles believed modernization gave him the right to review everything connected to the monarchy's future. Titles, residences, allocations, roles, structure, cost, symbolism, nothing would be beyond reconsideration. In theory, that sounds administrative. Practical, even. But in practice, according to the script, it meant something far sharper. It meant that what had once been granted could suddenly become subject to pressure. That pressure reportedly found its way to Bagshot Park. What makes that so dramatic is not just the property itself, but Edward's long history with it. When Bagshot Park was first offered to him, it was not some glittering prize dropped into his lap. It was worn down, neglected, expensive to restore, yeah, and no longer considered a particularly desirable royal residence. There were even serious ideas about repurposing it entirely. It was not treasured in the way it would later become. It needed work, money, patience, and commitment. Edward took it on anyway. That part matters because it changes the emotional logic of the whole conflict. This was not a man-handed perfection. This was a man-handed responsibility. He accepted the estate under a lease that may have sounded generous on paper, but came with enormous obligations. The place had to be restored, not eventually, not when convenient, properly. And that meant money, real money, private money. According to the transcript, Edward poured a substantial amount of his own funds into the estate long before the present dispute ever surfaced. He did not simply occupy Bagshot Park. And he invested in it, he preserved it, he carried burdens attached to it, he paid, he planned, he treated it as something worth building into the future. That is why the later pressure to reclaim or reframe the estate lands so differently. If a man has spent decades restoring a home, extending control over it, and securing a future around it, then trying to pull it back no longer looks like streamlining, it looks like erasure. And the numbers only deepen that impression. By the time the conflict intensified, Bagshot Park was no longer a worn property of uncertain use. It had become an immensely valuable asset. That transforms the story. Suddenly, the motive no longer looks purely institutional. Money enters the frame. If the estate could be brought back under central control, and it could become profitable in ways that would make any review look very convenient. So the question becomes unavoidable. Was this really about modernization, or was modernization simply the cleanest language for a power grab? That is the kind of question that keeps a viewer watching, because once it is asked, every move starts to look different, and Edward, if this account is to be believed, saw the danger coming long before the crisis became public. The legal file that reportedly arrived in March 2026 was not assembled overnight. It was built over years. Every lease term, every payment, every extension, every detail meant to prove not only emotional expectation but legal standing. That distinction is everything. In royal disputes, feelings can be brushed aside. Documents are harder to dismiss. So when that file was delivered, it carried 3 layers of force. First, it showed financial investment. Second, it tied Bagshot Park directly to the inheritance structure Edward believed had been protected for him. And third, it demonstrated stewardship over time. In other words, this was not simply a case of wanting to keep something. It was a case for why taking it away would be legally and morally indefensible. But even that was only one half of the battle. Because just when the property dispute was already volatile enough, the conflict reportedly became far more personal. Enter the tiara. If Bagshot Park represented status, continuity, and formal inheritance, the tiara represented something deeper: trust, intimacy, and the late Queen's personal affection for Sophie. That is why the jewelry audit was such a flashpoint. On the surface, an audit sounds routine, administrative, almost boring. But in royal life, the language of routine can hide much sharper intentions. According to the transcript, a review linked to Queen Camilla's office raised questions about jewelry Sophie had worn as her own for years, and at the center of that scrutiny was the anthem tiara, the piece made for her wedding. That was no ordinary royal accessory. It was personal from the beginning, and it had been created specifically for Sophie, tied to one of the most important days of her life, and associated with her so closely that it became part of her identity within the family. For years, she was not the royal, constantly seen in grand collections and endless displays. She occupied a quieter place. The tiara became her piece, her symbol, her one unquestioned claim, and that is exactly why challenging it carried so much emotional force. If the argument was that antique elements or historic materials made the piece effectively crown property, then the dispute was about much more than classification. It was about whether a personal gift from the monarch could later be reframed as something conditional. It was about whether a woman could be told that the item she wore on her wedding day was never really hers in the first place. That is not just administrative, that feels like humiliation. And the danger, according to Edward's side of the story, went well beyond Sophie. Because if that logic worked once, it could be applied again and again across the family. Personal gifts, long-standing assumptions, intimate tokens of trust, all of it could be reopened. Once that door is unlocked, who gets to close it again? That is what made the dispute so dangerous. It was not small at all, it was precedent. The emotional stakes rose even higher because this fight touched a deeper memory. Sophie's bond with Queen Elizabeth II had long been described as unusually warm. Over time, Sophie came to be seen as one of the women the late Queen trusted most. So if Elizabeth had given her a tiara, honored her personally, and confirmed ownership in writing, then questioning that gift was not merely a legal move, it was a challenge to the Queen's judgment, and that, in royal life, is no small thing. According to the transcript, Edward's legal team responded with exactly the kind of evidence needed to stop the claim at its root: a deed of gift identifying the tiara as a private wedding present. If true, that changes the argument instantly. It is no longer about custom or interpretation, it becomes about ownership. But the script does not stop there. It goes further because this is a story built on escalation. It adds another layer: that Edward had been involved in creating accompanying jewelry designed to work specifically with the tiara, tying the piece into a broader artistic unit, whether that argument was central or supplemental. And it had one purpose: to make the tiara even harder to isolate, seize, or redefine. Then comes one of the most emotionally effective details in the entire script: Sophie referring to Queen Elizabeth as Mama. That moment is powerful because it humanizes everything. Suddenly, the dispute is not just between offices, households, reviews, and legal teams. It is about loss, about memory, about what remains after someone you loved is gone. If the woman who gave you that piece was not just your sovereign, but your mother figure, then trying to take it back feels almost cruel in a way paperwork can never capture. And that is why the threat to release private letters became so explosive, because at that point, this was no longer just about who legally held what. It was about what Queen Elizabeth had privately intended, whom she trusted, and what she may have felt about the people now pressing against those decisions. If letters existed that strengthened Sophie's position and complicated Camilla's image, then they represented a kind of pressure the palace would have every reason to fear. Legal defeat is one thing, emotional and reputational damage is something else entirely. So by the time the tiara was reportedly placed under tighter private protection, the conflict had moved beyond inheritance. It had become a battle over memory, legitimacy, and the right to define what Queen Elizabeth's personal gifts actually meant. And then Princess Anne walked in. Every long royal drama needs a turning point, and this is the script's strongest one. Anne changes the energy of the story instantly because she brings something no one else can quite match: credibility without performance. She does not need drama to be formidable. She is formidable because people believe she means what she says. So when the conflict reportedly moved into a private room and Anne stepped into it, the balance changed. This was no longer Edward and Sophie resisting pressure on their own. Now the challenge had a defender whose authority came not from sentiment, but from principle. What gives Anne's role such force is the personal history behind it. She and Sophie were not always seen as especially close, but grief changes families, and after Prince Philip's death and then the Queen's final years, a different bond appears to have formed. Shared loss can do that. Shared duty can do that too. By the time the monarchy had entered its new era, the distance between them had reportedly given way to loyalty. So Anne was not entering that room as a spectator. She was entering it as someone defending what she believed their mother had decided. The line attributed to her is devastating in its simplicity. If their mother's signature on a lease or a deed of gift is no longer worth anything, then the king's signature will be worth even less tomorrow. That is not just a challenge. That is a strike at the foundation of royal authority, because monarchies depend on continuity. They depend on the idea that royal word carries weight, that documents matter, that official acts outlive the moods of the people who inherit the throne. If one monarch's clear decisions can be quietly hollowed out by the next, then trust in the entire structure starts to crack. Anne, in this script, understands that better than anyone. She also reportedly understood the specifics. Edward had invested money, the Crown estate had accepted it, agreements had been signed, terms had been established. This was not improvised royal sentiment, it was structured reality. So her position was blunt, the argument was already over, the commitments had been made, nothing remained except whether the palace would respect them. And then she widened the frame further. She did not treat the house and the tiara as separate matters. She treated them as the same principle under attack: two gifts, two protections, two attempts to redraw boundaries after the fact. If one could be taken back, then the other could too. And if both could be questioned, then nothing Queen Elizabeth had personally settled would be beyond revision. That is where the script turns especially effective. It stops being about specific objects and becomes about the sanctity of the late Queen's decisions. And Anne, if this telling is accurate, saw the human cost as clearly as the constitutional one. Sophie had already lost her mother young. Queen Elizabeth had become, over time, something emotionally close to that missing place. Anne had also lived through immense loss, first her father, and then her mother, and knew what remains when the people are gone: their words, their promises, their gifts, the things they touched and intended. Once you frame the dispute that way, it no longer looks like paperwork at all. It looks like someone reaching into grief and trying to reclassify it. No wonder Anne refused to stay quiet. The script then gives her one more role: enforcer. According to the claims in the transcript, she made it clear that if this pressure continued, she would not merely object in private. She would push back in ways that could carry public consequences, including scrutiny of the Queen's household itself. That threat matters, because Anne is one of the few royals whose seriousness is rarely doubted. If she signals discipline, people believe discipline is coming. She even reportedly drew a line around Edward's children, refusing to let wider pressure force choices about their place in royal life before the family itself was ready. That detail widens the emotional radius of the conflict yet again. Now, the issue is not just inheritance in the present, it is security, autonomy, and the future of the next generation. By the time Anne leaves the room, the king is trapped, and that is the next major beat in the story. Charles caught between two fires. On one side is his wife's push for central control, consistency, and authority. On the other is the legal and emotional weight of his mother's final decisions, reinforced by Edward's documentation and Anne's intervention. If he sides fully with the challenge, he risks looking like a king willing to dismantle his mother's settled intentions. And if he backs away, he risks looking weaker than the system he is trying to streamline. That is why this is such compelling royal drama. There is no clean exit. According to the transcript, Charles's own legal team eventually delivered the conclusion he least wanted to hear. Edward's position was effectively untouchable. The inheritance, the lease structure, the supporting documents, taken together, they formed a barrier that royal preference could not override. That is a brutal moment in the script because it strips the issue to its core. The king may reign, but he cannot simply reclaim what the law has placed beyond his reach. And if that were not painful enough, the file reportedly contained another blow: evidence that Prince Philip had knowingly supported these protections in his final phase of life. And that would mean this was not just Elizabeth's private choice. It was a united parental decision, a late act of alignment, a wall built by both father and mother around the son they believed might one day need it most. From there, the script shows the palace beginning to fracture under pressure. Staff choose sides. Quiet loyalties reveal themselves. Resentment builds. Internal discussions no longer feel safely contained. The monarchy, famous for control, starts to feel porous, and once an institution loses internal unity, it becomes far more vulnerable than any official statement will admit. Outside palace walls, the optics are even worse. A public already sensitive to money and privilege is not likely to respond warmly to a story in which a king appears to be pressing his brother over a home that brother helped restore at great personal cost. Even if the internal rationale were more complex, public emotion rarely waits for complexity. It chooses a side. And in a story like this, the side that appears dutiful, prepared, and unfairly targeted usually wins sympathy fast. That may be why the script includes one of its most telling details: Charles reaching for a family meeting through a handwritten note. Whether symbolic or strategic, that gesture suggests a pivot away from pure institutional force and toward personal resolution. But even that reportedly failed. Edward would not meet without legal representation present. That moment says everything. Because once a younger brother insists on lawyers before sitting down with the king, the old trust is gone. Whatever family instinct once existed has been replaced by caution, and caution, once earned inside a family, is almost impossible to undo. Then comes the formal endgame. Late in the day, according to the transcript, official confirmation arrived. The tiara would remain under Sophie's exclusive private control. The review of Bagshot Park would quietly stop. The wording may have been restrained, but the meaning was not. The challenge had failed, the palace had retreated, and in doing so it had effectively acknowledged in writing that Edward and Sophie's position stood. That is not just a victory, it is a record, and records matter in royal history because they outlive emotion. Long after arguments are denied and tensions are smoothed over in public, documents remain. Someone made a claim, someone resisted it, someone stepped back. The archive remembers even when the palace prefers not to. But victory does not restore trust. That is the final note the script lands on, and it is the right one. Because even if Edward kept the home, even if Sophie kept the tiara, even if the late queen's wishes held, the family itself is changed. Publicly, there may still be appearances of unity. There will still be events, ceremonies, careful smiles, controlled spacing, and the choreography royal families rely on when private damage must remain private. But inside the structure, the truth is harder to hide. One brother, according to this narrative, had to use the law to protect himself from another. Once that happens, the relationship never really goes back to what it was, and the monarchy does not return untouched either. The script leaves us with two centers of gravity, one gathered around Charles and Camilla, pushing control, consolidation, and a more tightly managed future. The other forming more quietly around Anne, Edward, and Sophie, backed by loyalty to what was already built and suspicion of any effort to rewrite it. It is not an open civil war, it is something colder and in some ways more lasting, a divide fixed by memory and reinforced by documents. For James and Lady Louise, the lesson is even more sobering. They would have watched all of this unfold and understood something crucial. In royal life, what is given is not always secure simply because it was given. Sometimes it must be defended, sometimes it must be documented. Sometimes it must be protected from the very institution that first placed it in your hands. That changes a person. It changes how the next generation looks at titles, homes, honors, and promises. It replaces innocence with caution, and caution has a long life in families shaped by power. As for Charles, the script ends him in a painfully complicated place. He still has the crown, he still has the structure of monarchy, he still has the legal and symbolic authority of the sovereign. But authority is not the same as trust. And trust may be the one thing this battle cost him most, because the brother who stayed quiet for decades, paid his own way, and caused no public chaos is no longer just the overlooked younger son. He is now the man who proved that preparation can beat pressure, that documents can beat hierarchy, and that sometimes the person everyone assumes will bend is the very one who finally refuses. And that is why this story lingers, not because of a title alone, not because of a mansion alone, not because of a tiara alone. It lingers because beneath all the royal language, all the legal arguments, and all the palace caution, the conflict asks a much more human question. When someone you trusted tries to redraw the boundary around what was promised to you, what do you do? According to this script, Edward answered that question with silence, patience, preparation, and when the moment came, refusal. And long after the paperwork is filed away, long after the palace returns to ceremony and controlled smiles, that may be the part nobody forgets.